Paulogia's minimal witness hypothesis purports to identify the least explanatorily demanding set of facts sufficient to account for the emergence of early Christian resurrection belief. Rather than asking whether the resurrection occurred, the hypothesis reframes the inquiry. Is a literal resurrection explanatorily necessary for the rise of Christianity? To that end, the hypothesis adopts a deliberately austere evidential scope. It brackets contested elements, most notably the empty tomb, group appearances, and later gospel narratives, and restricts itself to what it claims are the most secure data points across critical scholarship. The core datum is not the resurrection itself, but the existence of the Christian movement and its proclamation that Jesus had been raised. The explanatory burden is then reduced further. According to the hypothesis, resurrection belief can be sufficiently generated by the sincere experiences of two individuals, Peter and Paul. The hypothesis is as follows. First, Peter, following Jesus' execution, sincerely believed that Jesus appeared to him. The hypothesis explicitly refuses to specify the psychological mechanism underlying this experience, whether hallucination, vision, grief-induced misperception, or otherwise insisting only on sincerity coupled with error. Within Second Temple Jewish conceptual categories, such an experience, it is claimed, would naturally be interpreted as resurrection. Second, Paul later underwent an independent experience, likewise interpreted as an appearance of the risen Jesus. Paul's subsequent authority within the movement legitimized visionary experience as a valid epistemic ground for resurrection belief, thereby allowing the proclamation to spread without reliance on physical contact, an empty tomb, or collective eyewitness confirmation. From this point, theological reflection, narrative elaboration, and tradition formation are invoked to account for the later resurrection narratives. On this model, no deception, conspiracy, or mass hallucination is required. Only sincere belief, interpretive flexibility, and the passage of time. Finally, the hypothesis insists on its methodological modesty. It does not deny the resurrection. It claims only that the resurrection is no longer explanatorily necessary. Alternative naturalistic explanations, even if underdetermined, are deemed sufficient. The central failure of the minimal witness hypothesis is not that it is false, but that it fails to qualify as a hypothesis at all. A hypothesis, whether historical or scientific, must do more than gesture toward mere possibility. At minimum, it must commit to determinate claims, impose explanatory constraints, be accessible against available evidence, be falsifiable in principle. The minimal witness hypothesis deliberately declines to meet these conditions. While it asserts that Peter and Paul had sincere experiences, it explicitly refuses to specify the nature of those experiences, their psychological or cognitive structure, any diagnostic or phenomenological features, how such experiences reliably generate the specific claims being explained. The hypothesis's defenders may object that historical explanations are often probabilistic and need not specify detailed psychological mechanisms. It is true that historians need not invoke DSM classifications or neuroscientific accounts, but this objection misunderstands the critique. The issue is not the absence of clinical precision. It is the absence of explanatory commitment. To posit that someone had an experience without specifying what kind of experience, why it occurred, or how it accounts for the explanandum is not a probabilistic hypothesis. It is an unfalsifiable placeholder. Such a claim cannot be disconfirmed by any conceivable evidence, because no evidence counts against it. At that point, the proposal ceases to function as a hypothesis and collapses into a permissive narrative. Whatever happened, something psychological could have happened. The hypothesis's refusal to commit to a specific mechanism is not an epistemic virtue. It is a strategic necessity. The moment a mechanism is specified, the model becomes vulnerable to falsification. If a mental disorder is proposed, the burden shifts to demonstrating its plausibility in the relevant historical and contextual setting, an evidential task the hypothesis cannot meet. If grief-induced hallucination is invoked, the problem intensifies. While such phenomena are documented in general populations, there is no evidence that they occurred in this case. The appeal becomes purely speculative, retrofitted to the conclusion rather than derived from the data. This is not inference to the best explanation. It is inference to whatever explanation cannot be ruled out. The minimal witness hypothesis does not fail because it is implausible. It fails because it refuses to accept the obligations of hypothesis formation. By declining to specify mechanisms, constraints, or conditions of failure, it renders itself immune to critique at the cost of explanatory power. A proposal that survives only by avoiding falsifiability is not strengthened by its ambiguity. It is disqualified by it. A second, deeper problem confronts the minimal witness hypothesis. Its indeterminacy does not remain merely underdetermined. It collapses into methodological contradiction. In order to identify Peter and Paul as historical agents at all, the hypothesis must rely on the New Testament texts, most notably the undisputed Pauline letters. Yet under minimal witness methodology, these same texts are selectively disqualified whenever they supply details that resist the hypothesis's explanatory preferences. The result is a self-defeating evidential framework. The texts are treated as sufficiently reliable to establish the existence, identity, and prominence of specific witnesses. Yet those same texts are deemed unreliable precisely at the point where they specify the content, structure, and transmission of the experiences attributed to those witnesses. This is not source criticism. It is source instrumentalization. The case of 1 Corinthians 15. The methodological breakdown becomes explicit in the treatment of Paul's testimony. If Paul's letters are judged historically robust enough to establish Peter's primacy within the early movement, Paul's conversion experience, and the existence of resurrection proclamation as early Christian belief, then they are equally robust enough to establish that Paul received tradition and that this tradition explicitly names multiple witnesses. 1 Corinthians 15 to 3:8. There is no methodologically coherent principle by which the evidential force of the letters can be affirmed for 1, 3, while arbitrarily suspended for the tradition Paul claims to have received. Any attempt to do so violates the basic canons of historical consistency. At this juncture, Hume is frequently invoked but improperly. The claim under evaluation is not multiple witnesses to the resurrection, which would indeed risk circularity if the resurrection itself were presupposed. Rather, the claim is multiple witnesses to an event or experiences that generated resurrection belief. This distinction is decisive. Under the minimal witness framework itself, the occurrence of some experiential event is conceded. What is denied is its ontological interpretation. The hypothesis is therefore already committed to the existence of a triggering experiential variable, call it X, that produced resurrection belief. The question, then, is not whether multiple witnesses confirm the resurrection, but whether multiple witnesses attest to X. That claim is mundane. It carries a substantially lower evidential burden, and Paul's relaying of received tradition is more than sufficient to meet it. This creates a fatal problem for the hypothesis. Once multiple witnesses to X are admitted, any proposed mechanism for X must be sufficient not merely to explain Peter and Paul individually, but to account for multiple, independently named witnesses. This dramatically weakens the prior probability of any psychological mechanism proposed, because it now requires additional auxiliary explanations to account for distribution, convergence, and coherence across witnesses. The minimal witness hypothesis avoids this problem only by excluding multiple witnesses from the minimal facts, but there is no methodologically principled way to do so while retaining reliance on Paul's letters. Minimalism here is not earned, it is enforced. Selective skepticism is not critical rigor. It is evidential asymmetry. The final and most decisive failure of the minimal witness hypothesis concerns explanatory sufficiency. The core claim of the hypothesis is not merely that a naturalistic explanation of resurrection belief is possible, but that it is sufficient that the resurrection itself is no longer explanatorily necessary. This is a strong claim, and it invokes a recognizable principle of sufficient reason, which observes a cause is sufficient only if denying it would be more irrational than accepting it. Put differently, an explanation crosses the sufficiency threshold only when rejection incurs greater explanatory cost than assent. The relevant question, then, is not whether the minimal witness hypothesis is conceivable, but whether it is more irrational to deny than to affirm. The problem becomes decisive once the methodology of the minimal witness hypothesis is applied consistently. By its own rules, the hypothesis does not require specification of a mechanism. It requires only that the causal process appealed to be naturalistic and more probable than a supernatural resurrection. The mechanism may remain unspecified, psychologically indeterminate, and empirically unconstrained. Possibility, rather than explanatory detail, is treated as sufficient. Once this standard is granted, an alternative explanation immediately becomes available, one that the methodology itself has no principled grounds to exclude. Consider the following null hypothesis. Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, but the resurrection occurred through an unspecified naturalistic process. This hypothesis satisfies every methodological constraint imposed by the minimal witness framework. It does not invoke the supernatural. It does not specify a mechanism. It merely asserts that the resurrection event itself was naturalistic in cause, however opaque that cause may be. Crucially, this hypothesis is strictly more parsimonious with respect to the data. It explains not only the minimal facts resurrection belief, proclamation, conversion, but also the maximal facts traditionally bracketed by the hypothesis, including narrative coherence, early unanimity, and the absence of explanatory fragmentation. It does so without requiring a proliferation of auxiliary psychological or sociological assumptions. Within the minimal witness methodology, there is no principled basis for rejecting this hypothesis. Any objection raised against it, mechanistic opacity, improbability, lack of analogs, applies equally to the minimal witness explanation itself, which explicitly disavows mechanistic commitment and relies on underdetermined naturalistic processes. This reveals the fatal asymmetry. If a naturalistic resurrection hypothesis cannot be ruled out without violating minimal witness standards, then the minimal witness hypothesis fails to establish sufficiency. It can be denied without incurring greater explanatory cost. And under the principle of sufficient cause, any explanation that can be rationally denied without loss of explanatory power has not crossed the sufficiency threshold. The minimal witness hypothesis does not displace the resurrection as an explanation. It merely replaces one unexplained cause with many. Once methodological symmetry is enforced, the hypothesis collapses into parity with alternatives it was meant to exclude. It no longer explains why resurrection belief arose, only that it could have arisen somehow. And an explanation that can be rationally denied without explanatory penalty is not sufficient. It is optional. This concludes part 1 of the critique of the minimal witness hypothesis. The argument advanced here is not that the hypothesis is impossible, but that it fails on methodological grounds. It does not meet the standards required for explanatory sufficiency, and it collapses under its own criteria when applied consistently. If you disagree with this analysis, I invite substantive engagement. Identify where the reasoning fails, where methodological symmetry breaks, or where sufficiency has been demonstrated rather than assumed. Argument, not assertion, is the appropriate response. If you find the critique compelling, you are free to share it.